You know, there is a very specific thrill that comes with downloading a brand new app.
Oh, absolutely.
You open it up for the first time and seeing an interface that is just completely different from anything you've ever used before.
Right. It feels totally fresh.
Exactly. You swipe left and something unexpected happens. The menus are hidden behind some sleek new gesture. It feels futuristic, you know. It feels like progress.
Yeah. We all really love that feeling in our personal digital lives. It's exciting.
It really is. I'm your host, by the way, and welcome to today's deep dive. I'm sitting here with our resident design expert.
Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here to dig into this with you.
So here is the wild thing we are looking at today. What if I told you that in the professional world, designing a completely new interface is actually, well, a terrible idea?
Yeah, it goes against everything we assume, right? Because we have been conditioned to believe that new always equals better. And that innovation, it must be highly visible to be real. The assumption is basically that if a piece of software doesn't look like it belongs in a sci-fi movie, the developer simply didn't try hard enough.
And that exact tension is what we are going to explore in today's deep dive. So we are unpacking a really fascinating article that was recently published in February of 2026.
Yeah, it's a great piece.
It is called Innovate in the Product, Design for Familiarity, written by Tobias Reidenheck.
And just for some context for you listening, he is the head of design at Intunio.
Right, which is a Swedish UX design and development studio based in Gothenburg. They specialize in tackling incredibly complex digital designs.
Which is no small task.
Not at all. So our mission today is to dig into this completely counterintuitive philosophy they practice. It's the idea that when you are upgrading vital professional software, true innovation actually means making the interface as boring, predictable, and familiar as humanly possible.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really comes down to the fundamental reality of how human beings process information.
How so?
Well, in a world characterized by constant information overload, your attention is basically your most scarce resource.
That is so true. I feel constantly distracted.
Right. So a good interface, especially in a really high-stakes professional environment, it should never add to your cognitive load. It should be virtually invisible.
I love that phrase, virtually invisible.
You see.
Because the context here is just so important. Intunio isn't designing like a new social media feed where the goal is to keep you scrolling for hours.
No, definitely not.
They are working with organizations in heavy industrial sectors, manufacturing, and medical technology.
And these are environments where the stakes are incredibly high, but the digital tools are often lagging decades behind.
Oh, for sure.
It is very common in these fields to rely on legacy tools that were built 15 or even 20 years ago.
No, 20 years. That's a lifetime in tech.
Exactly. And if you picture what the digital landscape looked like 20 years ago, you were dealing with like gray bevel-embossed buttons, pixelated icons, and text-heavy screens designed for completely different technical conditions.
Before iPhones were even a thing.
Yeah, they were built for low-resolution monitors, a physical mouse and keyboard, and just vastly different physical workflows.
It's almost archaeological, really. You're unearthing software built for a world that simply doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
I can picture those massive, clunky CRT monitors sitting on a nurse's station right now.
I mean, we've all seen them. And the desire to modernize those specific systems is an entirely valid ambition.
Of course it is.
Because the professionals using these medical or industrial systems are the exact same people who go home at the end of their shift and use highly polished, seamless consumer applications on their personal devices.
Right, they're using Netflix and Spotify and Uber.
Exactly. They order food with 2 taps. They navigate massive music libraries effortlessly. So they naturally want the tools they use for their highly specialized critical work to match that quality.
It makes total sense.
They look at a dated, clunky industrial interface and think, well, this is making my job much harder than it needs to be.
Okay, let's unpack this because I completely understand that user frustration. It's like moving from a chunky 90s flip phone with the physical plastic number pad directly to a sleek, modern, edge-to-edge smartphone.
That's a great analogy.
You want that massive upgrade. You want the whole world to know you've stepped into the modern era. But here's my pushback.
Sure.
If the software is that ancient, if we're talking 15 or 20 years old, shouldn't a design studio like Intunio completely reinvent how it looks and feels.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, I mean, don't you have to drastically change the visual language to prove to the client and the users that the software is genuinely modern?
That is a very seductive trap.
A trap.
Yeah, the instinct is to tear everything down and build a flashy new paradigm. But what Reidenhag points out, and what Intunio sees in practice, is that inventing something completely new on the surface creates massive, paralyzing uncertainty for the user.
Oh, interesting. Paralyzing.
Exactly. Modernization rarely means inventing a new visual language. The absolute best results actually come from the exact opposite approach.
Which is
They come from borrowing.
borrowing. You mean literally lifting ideas from other apps?
Yes, borrowing established patterns, interaction principles, and behaviors from the modern tools that users already recognize.
Oh, I see.
It is about taking the visual and functional vocabulary of consumer products or well-designed everyday business applications and applying them directly to these complex environments.
So you're saying that a navigation pattern used in, say, a popular consumer streaming app or the way an everyday email client organizes folders could actually be translated into software used to calibrate automotive robotics.
Or to monitor patient vitals. Yeah, it translates surprisingly well.
That is wild.
And it relies on a specific mechanism of human psychology. A medical technician benefits from an interface that feels like a consumer app because the fundamental ways our brains understand digital systems are remarkably similar across the board.
Right. Our brains don't change just because we put on a lab coat.
Exactly. A drop-down menu functions like a drop-down menu. A search bar with auto-suggest behaves the way we expect it to behave.
So the content is different, but the mechanics are the same.
Right. The data within the system, like patient records versus a grocery list, differs wildly, but the neural pathways the human brain uses to navigate them are the exact same.
I want to pause on something you mentioned earlier because it ties right into this. You brought up cognitive load.
Yes, crucial concept here.
To put that in perspective for you listening, think of cognitive load like your brain's RAM, like your computer's short-term memory.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
You only have a finite amount of it available at any given second. If a factory interface takes up 80% of your brain's RAM just trying to figure out which hidden menu contains the emergency shutoff button, well, you only have 20% left for the actual physical crisis happening in front of you.
And in those fields, that RAM is precious. When users recognize familiar patterns, their cognitive load drops significantly.
Because they aren't relearning how to use a computer.
Exactly. They don't have to spend mental energy decoding the tool. By utilizing those pre-existing neural pathways built by everyday consumer apps, Intunio drastically reduces the need for thick instruction manuals.
Nobody likes reading those anyway.
Right. It reduces lengthy training sessions and frustrating periods of adaptation. The medical professional or the industrial worker can just keep their focus entirely on the critical task at hand.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you think about it, it is like how the gas pedal is always on the right side.
Oh, the car analogy, yes.
Yeah. Whether you're driving a heavy-duty farm tractor, a basic commuter sedan, or a luxury sports car, that pedal is on the right.
And the standardization across all those disparate machines is what makes operation possible for the average person.
Right. If a car designer came along and said, you know what, we are going to be super innovative.
Let's shake things up.
Exactly. We are swapping the gas and the brake pedals and maybe putting the steering wheel in the center console just to prove how modern this new car is.
You would crash before you left the dealership.
Literally.
Yeah.
The driver wouldn't be able to focus on the road because they are too busy trying to figure out how to operate the machine. The interface of the car, the steering wheel, the pedals is just a tool. It is not the goal. The goal is driving.
And for the software user, the interface is rarely a goal in itself. It is merely a vehicle for performing work, for making complex decisions, or for gaining an overview of a highly technical situation.
So any learning curve is basically just friction.
Yes. Intunio notes that in their work with complex products, even small, seemingly harmless deviations in behavior or structure can quickly create uncertainty.
Give me an example of that.
Well, if a designer changes the color of a critical warning label from red to, like, a trendy pastel blue just to look modern, people are going to hesitate.
Because red means danger. Blue means weather app.
Right. And in a hospital or on a factory floor, hesitation is dangerous.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this from the perspective of the developers, though. So what does this all mean for the actual creation of the product?
It changes the focus entirely.
Because if I'm playing devil's advocate here, it sounds like you're putting a completely new turbocharged engine
Okay.
inside a 15-year-old car chassis.
Okay, sticking with the car analogy, I like it.
Yeah. If we aren't changing the chassis, like we aren't innovating on the surface interface, how do these developers justify their paychecks? Where does the innovation actually happen?
Well, Intunio's philosophy is not about avoiding innovation, not at all. It is about placing innovation where it actually belongs.
Under the hood.
Exactly. The greatest innovation potential for most products does not lie on the surface of the interface, it lies underneath. It is in the deep product innovation.
Okay, what does deep product innovation actually entail?
It is in how the entire service is structured, the underlying logic, and how different complex systems interact with one another behind the scenes.
Give me a concrete sense of what that looks like. Walk me through a scenario where the interface stays boring, but the product is deeply innovated.
Sure. Let's look at a common scenario in a hospital setting.
Okay.
Imagine a nurse who currently has to document a patient's vitals. In the legacy system, they might have to open an admissions module first, just to check the patient ID.
Okay, step one.
Then they have to switch to a lab module to look up recent blood work.
That's step two in a totally different window.
Right. And then open a separate charting module to manually type in the current vitals.
Wow. They are basically acting as the human bridge between three different databases that refuse to speak to one another.
Which is incredibly common, unfortunately.
And it sounds incredibly tedious and prone to human error.
Very much so. Now, a superficial design studio might come in and say, let's make all three of those modules look beautiful. Let's add smooth animations and modern fonts.
Make it a dark mode.
Right, give it a sleek dark mode. But the nurse still has to manually bounce between three siloed systems.
The actual work hasn't improved at all.
Exactly. Intunio's approach to deep product innovation tackles the back-end architecture instead. They do the hard, invisible work of integrating those databases.
Okay, so how does it look for the nurse now?
Now, the nurse opens a single, familiar-looking digital chart. The patient ID and the recent blood work are automatically pulled in and displayed alongside the input field for the new vitals.
So a task that used to require 15 clicks, cross-referencing and memorization, now takes, what, 3 clicks?
Basically, yeah. The system anticipates what data the user needs next and has it ready. It supports the user's goals without forcing them to learn a completely new visual paradigm.
That's huge.
When the core product evolves correctly, when that underlying logic is streamlined and real workflow problems are solved, the surface interface can remain incredibly stable.
And I imagine the user still notices a massive difference, even if it looks familiar. Like they don't care that the buttons are the same shape if they get to go home on time.
The user experiences the tool as significantly improved because the friction has disappeared. They feel the speed. They feel the efficiency.
Right.
The software is doing the heavy lifting rather than demanding the user compensate for bad architecture. The interface didn't need to be reinvented for the product to become vastly superior.
That is such a profound shift in perspective. You're innovating the experience of the work rather than just the visual aesthetic of the tool.
Yes, exactly. Experience over aesthetics.
You're making the user faster and more accurate, which in these industries translates to saved money or even saved lives.
But it requires a tremendous amount of discipline from the design and development teams. Frankly, it is much easier to design a flashy new interface in a vacuum to show off to a client during a pitch meeting.
Oh, I bet.
Untangling decades of messy back-end logic, mapping out every edge case, and streamlining a complex workflow takes immense, rigorous effort.
Wait, I'm struggling with this a bit. Let's talk about the client dynamic because human ego has to play a role here.
It always does.
Imagine I'm a hospital administrator or a manufacturing CEO. I just signed off on a multi-million-dollar budget to upgrade our enterprise software.
A huge investment.
Right. And the development team comes back 6 months later, and the new tool looks pretty much exactly like a polished version of the old tool. Or maybe just looks like a standard email client.
I'd probably be shocked.
I'm going to feel ripped off. I want a visible symbol of renewal to show my board of directors that we are cutting edge. How does a studio like Intunio navigate the client's ego when the best solution is to just be boring?
What's fascinating here is that Intunio maintains a very strict, almost uncompromising philosophy regarding this specific issue.
Which is?
UI innovation must earn its place.
Earn its place.
They have to educate the client that surface-level reinvention is often just a marketing gimmick. It might impress a board of directors during a 10-minute demonstration, but it will actively sabotage the workforce who has to use it for 8 hours a day.
So they have to prove that boring is actually better for the bottom line.
They rely heavily on testing and metrics. When you show a hospital board that the boring interface reduces charting errors by 30% and saves each nurse an hour a shift, the ego of wanting a flashy interface tends to evaporate pretty quickly.
The numbers speak for themselves.
The return on investment is found in operational efficiency, not aesthetic novelty.
Okay, but surely there has to be a line. There have to be exceptions. We aren't just going to use the exact same grid layouts and drop-down menus for the next 100 years.
No, of course not.
Intunio can't possibly believe that you should never innovate the user interface.
Right. They are very clear that there are nuances and exceptions. There are specific situations where UI innovation is not just justified, but entirely necessary.
Walk me through what triggers that kind of shift.
It generally happens when established patterns are simply no longer sufficient for the task, or when the technological landscape shifts fundamentally.
What's a good example of a technological shift?
Think about the transition from the desktop era to the mobile era.
Okay, yeah.
The established pattern for interacting with a computer was a physical mouse and a keyboard. When smartphones introduced multi-touch screens, developers couldn't just shrink down a desktop interface and expect people to tap tiny drop-down menus with their thumbs.
Right, those old early mobile websites were a nightmare.
They were. That required genuine UI innovation. We saw the invention of swipe gestures, pinch to zoom, and the hamburger menu.
The hardware forced the software to evolve.
Exactly. It also happens when entirely new forms of interaction become possible. Consider the current emergence of spatial computing.
Oh, like augmented reality headsets.
Yes, using AR headsets where your interface isn't a flat screen anymore, but 3D holographic windows floating in your physical room.
Right, you can't just use a standard website layout for that.
You really can't. You can't use traditional 2D consumer app patterns. You have to innovate new visual languages based on eye tracking, hand gestures, and spatial awareness.
Because the fundamental physical reality of the user has changed.
Exactly. Another trigger is when the fundamental needs of the user shift in a way that the old patterns just can't accommodate.
Like what?
Well, if a piece of industrial software transitions from being operated by a solitary engineer in a control room to being a collaborative tool used simultaneously by a globally distributed team,
Oh, okay.
the interface must innovate to represent that real-time collaboration. It can't just be a single user dashboard anymore.
But even in those exceptional cases, I imagine the process isn't reckless.
Not at all. It requires immense restraint. If you are going to change the way an interface works, it must solve a concrete, identifiable problem.
It can't just be for the sake of being new.
Right. It must be carefully, rigorously tested with the actual users in their actual working conditions. And crucially, it should be introduced gradually.
So you don't shock the system.
You don't overhaul the entire system overnight. You introduce the new paradigm piece by piece so as not to disrupt the critical workflows of the industry.
It really all comes back to respecting the person on the other side of the screen.
It really does.
Choosing not to innovate the interface is often misconstrued as a lack of ambition or like a lack of creativity from the designers. But in reality, it is an active, highly deliberate decision.
Yes.
It is an expression of deep focus and immense respect for the user's time and mental bandwidth. By utilizing familiar patterns, you are deliberately creating the space to innovate where it truly matters in the underlying product, the service, and the user's real experience over time.
And taking a step back, this entire philosophy highlights a really profound dependency. Professional software is explicitly borrowing its best practices from the consumer world.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
The medical technician's interface works well because it mimics the intuitive flow of the streaming apps and social platforms they use at home.
Which makes total sense, given how much money Silicon Valley pours into optimizing consumer user experience.
But this raises an important question, something for you listening to mull over as you interact with the digital world today.
I love a good thought experiment. Let's hear it.
If the best, most critical industrial and medical tools are inheriting their interface patterns from everyday consumer apps, what happens when those consumer apps stop optimizing for usability?
Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, we are increasingly seeing consumer apps optimize purely for addiction, engagement metrics, and screen time.
Right. They just want our eyeballs for as long as possible.
Exactly. We see the rise of dark patterns. These are interfaces specifically designed to manipulate human behavior.
Like making it impossible to delete an account.
Yes, mechanisms like making the cancel subscription button nearly invisible, using infinite scrolling to eliminate natural stopping cues, or employing slot machine-style pull-to-refresh animations that trigger dopamine hits.
Wow.
These are design innovations, but their goal is to trap the user, not to assist them.
Oh, well, I see where you're going with this.
If the baseline of what feels familiar to a user is slowly being corrupted by manipulative consumer design, will the critical tools that run our hospitals and factories eventually be forced to inherit those same dark design patterns just to feel normal to the next generation of workers?
That is wild to think about.
If the workforce of tomorrow expects an interface to constantly barrage them with notifications and gamified rewards, how does a studio like Intunio build a calm, boring interface that still feels intuitive?
That is a slightly terrifying but incredibly important thought experiment. If our everyday apps train our brain's RAM to constantly seek out distraction and friction, designing a boring tool for a surgeon or a power plant operator might actually start to feel unnatural to them,
We are trusting the consumer tech industry to set the psychological baseline for the tools that actually keep our society running.
which might be a very dangerous game to play. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden world of interface design, cognitive load, and the power of restrained innovation.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To you listening, the next time you log into a piece of software at work and it feels surprisingly predictable and easy to navigate, recognize that it wasn't an accident. A designer made a very deliberate choice to borrow those patterns so you could simply get your work done in peace. Keep looking closely at the tools you use every day, stay curious, and keep exploring.